The candles in the ballroom were still burning when Eleanor heard the words that would break her marriage in half. "Everyone knows," Lord Pemberton said, his voice low and smiling, a glass of wine loose in his hand. "The Duke has a woman in Bath, has had her for months. You are the only person in this room who did not know it." Eleanor did not move. The music kept playing behind her, violins climbing into a bright, careless tune, as if nothing in the world had just cracked open. "You are mistaken," she said. "Am I?" Pemberton smiled wider. "Ask him yourself. Ask him tonight." She turned from him without another word and walked through the crowd, past silk gowns and powdered faces, past people who stopped talking the moment she came near, as if her name had already become something to whisper about. She had felt eyes on her all evening. Now she understood why. She found her husband on the terrace, alone, looking out over the dark garden with a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. Alaric Whitmore, Duke of Ashcombe, stood the way he always stood, straight-backed and still, a man built for portraits rather than conversations. "Is it true?" she asked. He turned. For one moment, something crossed his face that she had never seen before. Not surprise, guilt. "Is what true?" he asked, though his voice had already answered her. "There is a woman in Bath," Eleanor said. "You are keeping her, paying for her lodging, visiting her in secret." Her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her gown, had curled into fists. "Tell me it is a lie, and I will believe you, because I have never once caught you lying to me before." He was quiet. 3 seconds. 4. It was the silence that broke her, not the words that came after it. "It isn't what you think," he said finally. Eleanor almost laughed. It was such a small, useless sentence, the kind men reached for when they had run out of anything true to say. "It isn't what you think." As if there were some other meaning to a man visiting a woman in secret for months, some meaning that did not end in the same place all the other meanings ended. "Then tell me what it is," she said. He did not answer. Not because he could not, she would understand much later, but because the truth involved his brother's name, and his brother's name was a wound he had never let anyone touch, not even her. So he said nothing, and Eleanor, who had spent 3 years learning to read silence, the way other women read letters, understood this silence perfectly. She turned and walked back into the ballroom, her spine straight, her face calm, while inside her chest something was already packing its bags. She did not cry that night. She had promised herself long ago that she would never cry in a room full of people who would enjoy watching her do it. By the time the carriage brought her home, it was past midnight. She walked past the portraits of dead Whitmores lining the staircase, their painted eyes following her the way they always did, and went straight to her room. She did not ring for her maid. She packed her own small trunk, folding each dress herself, because there was something steadying in doing it alone, something that made the whole terrible night feel like a decision instead of a collapse. She was still awake when the sun came up. She had not decided to leave. She had simply packed, the way a person sometimes prepares for a storm before admitting one is coming. 3 years earlier, she had married a stranger to save her father from ruin. She had known, going in, that there would be no love in it, only survival, only the quiet arithmetic of debts paid and a family name rescued. She had told herself that was enough, that a woman could build a life out of arrangement and duty, the way builders raised houses out of stone instead of soil. What she had not expected was to fall in love with him anyway, slowly, without meaning to, the way ivy finds its way up a wall no one asked it to climb. She had not expected either that it would end like this, with a rumor and a silence, and a man on a terrace who could not say the one sentence that would have saved them both. The morning after the ball, she came down to breakfast to find him already at the table, reading a letter, his coffee gone cold beside him. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said. "Not yet. I am not ready to hear whatever you are about to tell me, and I do not think you are ready to tell it honestly." He set the letter down. His jaw tightened, the way it always did when he was holding something back. "You do not know the whole of it. "Then tell me the whole of it," she said. "Now, not later, not when it suits you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw, briefly, something that might have been fear. Not fear of her leaving, fear of what the truth would cost him if he let it out into the light. "I cannot," he said. "Not yet." "Then I cannot stay," she said, and she meant it as a warning, not a decision, though later she would understand it had already become both. She left the breakfast room without eating. She did not see the way his hand shook when he picked the coffee cup back up, or the way he sat there long after she had gone, staring at nothing, a man watching his own future quietly walk out of a doorway. That evening, the housemaid Alice found her folding linens in the small sitting room, a task Eleanor had taken to doing herself in recent weeks, simply to have something to occupy her hands. "Your Grace," Alice said carefully, "may I speak plainly?" Eleanor nodded, grateful for a voice that was not weighing every word for hidden meaning. "The Duke does not sleep," Alice said. "I have brought fresh linens to his room 3 nights this week and found the bed untouched. He sits in the library until dawn. I have seen him there myself, reading old letters, the same ones, over and over." "What letters?" Eleanor asked, though something in her chest already knew, the way a person knows a storm is coming before the first drop falls. "I do not know, Your Grace. I only know he does not look like a man who is happy in whatever he is doing in Bath. He looks like a man carrying something he cannot put down." Eleanor thanked her and said nothing more, but that night, unable to sleep herself, she went down to the library. It was past 1 in the morning. She found her husband exactly where Alice had said he would be, a small stack of letters spread before him on the desk, his head bowed over them, one hand pressed against his mouth. He did not hear her come in. She stood in the doorway and watched him read a letter for what must have been the 4th or 5th time, his shoulders rising and falling with a kind of grief she had never seen him show to anyone, not even at his own brother's funeral 2 years before, when he had stood dry-eyed and rigid while the rest of the family wept. She recognized the handwriting on the letter before she recognized anything else. It was her mother's hand. Small, careful, slightly slanted to the left. Her mother, who had died the year before the wedding. Letters Eleanor had believed lost in the chaos after the funeral, when so many of her mother's things had been sold or given away to settle her father's debts. She did not understand, in that moment, why her husband would be sitting alone in the dark, reading letters written by a woman he had never even met. She only understood that whatever he was carrying, it was heavier than she had guessed, and older than the woman in Bath, and far more complicated than a simple betrayal. She almost stepped forward, almost said his name. Instead, she watched him fold the letter carefully, the way a person folds something they are afraid of tearing, and place it back with the others, and she turned and went back upstairs, carrying a question she was not yet brave enough to ask. The next morning, he was ice again. He passed her the toast at breakfast and remarked on the weather, as if the night before had never happened, as if she had not stood in a doorway and watched a duke cry over a dead woman's letters. She almost asked him then. The words rose in her throat and sat there, heavy and unspoken. She did not ask, and that, she would later understand, was her own failure as much as his, the two of them circling the truth for months, each waiting for the other to be brave first. It was Lord Pemberton who finally forced the truth into the open, though not out of any kindness. Pemberton had wanted Eleanor for himself, 3 years before, back when her father's debts had first become public knowledge, and half the men in London had begun circling her like she was a piece of property about to go to auction. The Duke had offered marriage before Pemberton could make his own offer, and Pemberton had never forgiven either of them for it. He had learned, through means Eleanor would only later understand, that the Duke made regular visits to a house in Bath. He had not learned who lived there, or why. He had simply taken the fact of the visits and built around it the ugliest story he could imagine, and then he had told that story to every drawing room in London, until it had become, in the way that rumors do, more true to everyone else than the truth itself. He had planned it carefully. He had waited for a night when the ballroom would be full, when Eleanor would have no way to hide her reaction, when the damage would be done before either she or the Duke had a chance to speak privately. He had succeeded better than he expected. By the following week, Eleanor had moved into her sister Margaret's townhouse with a single trunk and a heart she was trying very hard to keep locked shut. She told herself it was only for a few days, until her head cleared, until she understood her own feelings well enough to decide what came next. She did not yet know that the man she had left behind was, at that very moment, riding toward Bath in the rain, carrying with him the one truth that could have saved his marriage, if only he had found the courage to speak it 3 years sooner. Margaret's townhouse was smaller than anything Eleanor had lived in since childhood, but it was quiet, and quiet was the only thing she wanted. She spent her first days there doing very little, sitting by the window with a cup of tea gone cold, watching carriages pass on the street below, wondering how many of the people inside them already knew her name and her shame. Margaret did not press her for details. She had learned long ago that her sister spoke when she was ready, and not a moment before. Instead, she simply kept the house calm, kept meals arriving at regular hours, and let Eleanor sit with her silence, until the silence began to feel less like a wound and more like a room she could actually live in. It was on the 4th day that a letter arrived from the Duke. Eleanor recognized the seal before she recognized the handwriting. She held it for a long moment without opening it, turning it over in her hands as though she could weigh its contents simply by touch. She did not open it that day. She placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, beneath a stack of old sheet music, and told herself she would read it when she was ready. She was not ready for 3 more days. When she finally broke the seal, she found only a handful of lines, written in a hand far less steady than his usual careful script. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that the woman in Bath was not what she believed. He wrote that he could not explain everything in a letter, that some truths were owed to her in person, not on paper, and that he intended to come to her as soon as certain matters were settled. She read it once. Then she folded it and put it away, and did not read it again. She told herself she did not believe him. In truth, she believed him a little too easily, and that frightened her more than any lie could have. She had spent 3 years learning not to hope for more from her marriage than duty and civility. Hope, she had discovered, was a dangerous thing to keep in a house built on debts and arrangements. It had a way of growing roots in places a person could not afford to lose. She decided, instead, to build something of her own. It began with a suggestion from Margaret, who mentioned, almost in passing, that a family 2 streets over was looking for someone to teach their daughters the pianoforte. Eleanor had played since childhood, one of the few comforts her mother had insisted on despite the family's dwindling fortunes, and the idea of doing something with her hands and her mind, something that belonged entirely to her, felt like air after a long time spent underwater. She took the position within the week. Then another family asked for lessons, having heard from the first, and by the end of the month she had 4 students and a small, steady income that belonged to no one but herself. It was strange, she found, how much lighter a person could feel earning a little money honestly than living surrounded by a great deal of money that had never truly been hers. She was walking home from a lesson one afternoon, her music case tucked under her arm, when she became aware of a carriage slowing beside her. She recognized the crest on the door, before she recognized the face inside it. Lord Pemberton stepped down onto the pavement with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no and meant it. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, using her title the way some men use a compliment, as though bestowing something rather than simply stating a fact. Walking the streets alone. "How very modern of you." "Lord Pemberton," she said, and kept walking. He fell into step beside her, unbothered by her tone. "I heard you had left the Duke's house. I confess I was not surprised. A man who keeps a woman hidden away in Bath does not deserve a wife like you." "I did not ask for your opinion," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed easily. "But you might want it all the same. I know things about your husband that you do not." Eleanor stopped walking. Something in his voice had shifted, something colder underneath the smoothness. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Pemberton said, stepping closer than was proper, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath even in the middle of the afternoon, "that a woman in your position ought to consider her future carefully. Your father's debts did not disappear simply because a duke married you. They were only delayed. If your marriage ends, as it appears it might, those debts will return, and this time there may not be another duke waiting to save you." "Is that a threat?" Eleanor asked, her voice very quiet, very still. "It is a fact," Pemberton said, smiling again, "but I am not without generosity. I could arrange for those debts to vanish entirely. All I would ask in return is your company, your friendship, nothing more, for now." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach, the particular coldness of understanding exactly what a man means when he insists he means nothing by his words. "I would rather owe money to every creditor in London," she said, "than owe anything at all to you." She turned and walked away before he could answer, her spine straight, her music case clutched tightly to her chest, though her hands, hidden beneath its weight, were shaking. She did not tell Margaret what had happened. She told herself it was because she did not want to worry her sister. In truth, she was beginning to understand that Pemberton had built the rumor about the Duke for a reason far uglier than mere gossip, and admitting that meant admitting she was now, in some sense, being hunted. 2 days later, a note arrived at Margaret's house, unsigned, written in a hand she recognized as Pemberton's despite his effort to disguise it. It contained only a single line. "Your father's newest debts have been purchased. By whom, I wonder, would you like to guess?" Eleanor sat with the note in her lap for a long time after reading it, staring at the fire in the small sitting-room grate, feeling the walls of the safe little life she had built for herself in 3 short weeks begin, very quietly, to close in. She thought then of the Duke, of his letter still sitting in her writing desk beneath the sheet music, of the way he had cried over her mother's letters in the dark, alone, when he thought no one was watching. Whatever else he had done, whatever he had failed to say, she did not believe him capable of the kind of coldness Pemberton had just shown her without a flicker of shame. She did not yet know that at that very moment, in a small rented house in Bath, the Duke was sitting beside a woman named Charlotte, his brother's widow, watching her cradle a newborn daughter in her arms, and making a promise to a dead man that had cost him, without his ever intending it, the living woman he loved most. Charlotte had come to him 5 months earlier, thin and frightened, carrying a child that was not his, but that belonged, by blood, to the only brother he had ever had. Edmund had died before he knew Charlotte was carrying his child, killed in a riding accident that had taken the family by surprise and left behind a scandal Charlotte alone would have to answer for, since she and Edmund had married in secret, against the family's wishes, only weeks before his death. If the truth came out, Charlotte would be ruined, her child born into a scandal that would follow it for life, and Edmund's memory, already fragile in a family that had never fully forgiven him for marrying beneath his station, would be dragged through every drawing room in London. The Duke had made a choice, in the quiet weeks after his brother's funeral, to protect them both in secret. He had rented the house in Bath under a false name. He had visited when he could, bringing money, bringing what comfort he was able to offer, a grieving young widow he barely knew but felt, in some strange way, responsible for, as though protecting her was the last thing he could still do for his brother. He had told no one, not his mother, who still believed Edmund had died unmarried and childless, not his solicitor, who managed the family's affairs and would have insisted on handling the matter differently, more coldly, more concerned with reputation than with the frightened young woman at the center of it, and not Eleanor, though he told himself, again and again, in the quiet hours when he could not sleep, that he meant to tell her eventually, when the timing was right, when he had found the words that would not sound like an excuse. He had never found those words in time. Now he sat in Charlotte's small parlor, the baby asleep in her arms, and understood, with the particular clarity that only comes after it is too late to matter, that his silence had cost him everything, and that the timing he had been waiting for had never existed at all. There had only ever been the choice to speak or not to speak, and he had chosen wrong, over and over, for months. "You must go to her," Charlotte said quietly, watching him from across the room. "Whatever it costs you, whatever she says, you must tell her the truth, all of it, before it is too late." "She left me," the Duke said. "I do not know that she will listen." "Then you will have to make her listen," Charlotte said. "I did not survive losing Edmund only to watch you lose everything for the sake of a secret that was never truly yours to keep alone." He left for London the following morning, before the sun had fully risen, riding through a cold and steady rain that soaked through his coat within the first hour and did not let up for the rest of the journey. He did not stop to rest. He did not stop to eat. He rode as though the truth, once decided upon, might slip away from him again if he gave it even a moment to be reconsidered. He did not yet know that Eleanor, at that very hour, was folding Pemberton's note into the fire, watching it curl and blacken and disappear, and telling herself, with a conviction she did not entirely feel, that she would face whatever came next alone if she had to, rather than owe anything to a man who mistook cruelty for kindness. Neither of them knew, as the rain fell over London and over the road from Bath alike, that the truth was only hours away from finally being spoken, or that speaking it would not be the end of the story, but only the beginning of its hardest part. The rain had not stopped by the time the Duke reached London. His horse was exhausted, his coat soaked through to the skin beneath, and his hands, gripping the reins, had long since gone numb with cold. He did not care. He rode straight to Margaret's townhouse, arriving just as the last grey light of afternoon was fading into evening, and knocked on the door with a force that startled the footman who answered it. "I must see Lady Ashcombe," he said, though the title felt strange in his mouth now, after weeks of her absence. "Please, it cannot wait." Margaret came to the hallway herself before the footman could answer, her face carefully composed in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to show her true feelings. "She does not wish to see you," she said. "I understand that," the Duke said. "I am asking anyway." Something in his voice, or perhaps in the state of him, soaked and shaking, and entirely without his usual composure, made Margaret hesitate. She had never seen a duke look quite so undone. "Wait here," she said finally, and disappeared up the stairs. Eleanor was in the small sitting room when Margaret found her, a piece of half-finished sheet music on the stand before her, though she had not played a note in the last quarter hour, only stared at it, her mind elsewhere entirely. "He is here," Margaret said, "downstairs. He looks as though he rode through the storm without stopping." Eleanor's hands went still on the keys. "I do not wish to see him. I told him that. And he said he understood, and then he asked to see you anyway." Margaret came further into the room, her voice softening. "Eleanor, I have never once told you what to do in your own marriage, and I will not begin now. But I have also never seen a man look the way he looks, standing in our hallway. Whatever he has come to say, I do not think it is nothing." Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. Then she rose, smoothed her skirts with hands that were not quite steady, and went down the stairs. He was standing in the front hall, dripping onto the floor, his hair plastered to his forehead, his coat clinging to his shoulders. He looked, she thought, nothing at all like the composed and distant man she had married 3 years before. He looked like someone who had been stripped of every defense he usually carried. "Eleanor," he said. "You look terrible," she said, because it was the only thing she could think to say, and because it felt safer than any of the things she actually wanted to say. "I have been riding since before dawn," he said. "I did not stop, because I was afraid that if I stopped, I would find some reason to turn back, and I have turned back from this conversation too many times already." "Then you had better come in before you catch your death," she said, though her voice remained cool, guarded, unwilling yet to soften. She led him into the small sitting room, where a fire burned low in the grate, and stood with her arms crossed, waiting, while he tried to find the words he had rehearsed the entire ride from Bath and now found had scattered somewhere along the road. "The woman in Bath is not my mistress," he said finally. "She is Charlotte. She was married to my brother Edmund, in secret, weeks before he died. She is carrying his child. She has been carrying his child this entire time. I have been visiting her because someone had to, because if the truth came out before I could arrange things properly, she would be ruined, and the child with her, and Edmund's memory would be dragged through every drawing room in London by people who never understood him even while he was alive. Eleanor did not move. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the fire, cracking softly in the grate. Edmund was married, she said slowly, testing the words. Yes. And you knew. I have known for 5 months. And you said nothing. Her voice, which had been quiet, began to rise, not into anger exactly, but into something sharper, more precise. 5 months, Alaric. 5 months of watching me wonder what was wrong with our marriage. 5 months of letting rumors grow because you would rather protect a secret than protect me. I know, he said. I have no defense for it. I told myself I was protecting Charlotte, protecting Edmund's name, and those things were true, but they were not the only truth. The other truth is that I did not know how to tell you, because telling you meant admitting how badly I have always failed at saying the things that matter most. I have known you for 3 years, Eleanor, and I have loved you for at least 2 of them, and in all that time, I have never once found the courage to say so out loud, not even to myself, until the moment I thought I had lost you. Eleanor's arms uncrossed slowly. Something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the ball, loosened just slightly, though she did not yet let herself trust it. You should have told me, she said, about Edmund, about Charlotte, even if you could not yet tell me the other thing. I know, he said again. I have known it since the moment I watched you walk away from me on that terrace. I rode here to say it properly, because I could not bear the thought of you believing, even for one more day, that I had betrayed you in the way that everyone assumed. Eleanor sat down slowly in the chair by the fire, her legs suddenly unwilling to hold her steady. He remained standing, still dripping, still cold, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and unguarded and afraid. There is something else, she said. The night I found you in the library, reading my mother's letters, I never asked you about it. I should have. He was quiet for a moment. Your mother wrote to me, he said, before the wedding. She was already ill by then, though none of us knew how ill. She wrote asking me to be kind to you, since she would not be there to see how the marriage turned out. She wrote that you were stronger than you seemed, and that if I ever earned your trust, I would find in you the finest woman in England, and if I did not earn it, I would deserve whatever loneliness followed. Eleanor's eyes filled without her permission. She wiped at them quickly, angry at her own tears, though she could not have said whether the anger was at him or at herself, or simply at the whole unbearable shape of the last few months. I read her letters when I could not sleep, he continued, because they were the only place I still felt close to understanding what kind of husband I was supposed to be, and how far I had fallen short of it. I never told you, because it felt like something private of hers, something I had no right to share, even with you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire popped softly. Somewhere upstairs, a door closed, and Eleanor understood that Margaret had likely been listening from the landing and had just retreated to give them privacy. I want to believe you, Eleanor said finally, about Charlotte, about all of it, but wanting to believe something is not the same as trusting it, and you have given me a great deal of practice at not trusting you these past months. I know, he said. I am not asking you to trust me tonight. I am only asking you to know the truth, whatever you decide to do with it. She nodded slowly, and for a moment, something like peace settled over the room, fragile but real. It did not last. There was a sharp knock at the front door, urgent and repeated, and a moment later Margaret's voice rose from the hallway, tense in a way that made both Eleanor and the Duke come quickly to their feet. It is a messenger, Margaret said, appearing in the doorway with a folded paper in her hand, her face pale. For you, Eleanor. He says it is urgent. He says it concerns your father. Eleanor took the paper with hands that had begun, without her permission, to shake. She broke the seal and read it once. Then again, her face going white. "What is it?" the Duke asked, stepping closer. "My father," she said. "He has been taken to a debtor's house. His creditors moved against him this morning, all at once, as though someone had arranged for every debt to come due on the very same day." She looked up at the Duke, and something cold moved behind her eyes. "Pemberton," she said, "he told me he had purchased my father's newest debts. I did not believe he would truly use them. I thought it was only a threat, a cruelty meant to frighten me." "It was both," the Duke said grimly. "Men like Pemberton rarely make idle threats. They make promises, and then they wait for the moment that will hurt the most before they keep them." "I have to go to him," Eleanor said, already moving toward the door. "My father cannot survive a debtor's house. Not at his age, not with his health, as poor as it has been." "Then we will go together," the Duke said, and there was no question in his voice, only certainty. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding. Whatever remained unresolved between them, whatever trust still needed rebuilding, her father's safety could not wait for either of them to finish deciding how they felt. They rode through the rain together, the Duke's carriage moving as fast as the slick streets allowed, both of them silent, both of them thinking the same grim thought without saying it aloud, that Pemberton had not simply wanted to frighten Eleanor. He had wanted to force her hand, to make her so desperate that she would have no choice but to accept whatever terms he offered. They found her father at the debtor's house exactly as the letter had described, pale and shaking, sitting on a hard bench in a cold room with a handful of other men whose fortunes had likewise collapsed beneath them. He looked up when Eleanor entered, his face crumpling with a mixture of relief and shame that broke her heart nearly as much as seeing him there in the first place. "I did not know," he said, his voice thin. "The debts were sold without warning. I woke this morning to find men at my door with papers I had never seen before, demanding payment I could not possibly produce on a single day's notice." "I know, Papa," Eleanor said, kneeling beside him and taking his cold hands in hers. "I know who did this, and I know why." The Duke, meanwhile, had already moved to speak with the house's keeper, his voice low and controlled despite the fury Eleanor could see tightening the muscles of his jaw. Money changed hands. Papers were produced and signed. Within the hour, her father was free to leave, the debts settled in full by a Duke who had, until that very evening, believed himself in danger of losing his wife entirely, and who now found himself fighting, without hesitation, to protect the family she had almost lost along with him. "This is not finished," the Duke said quietly to Eleanor as they helped her father into the carriage. "Pemberton will not stop simply because tonight's scheme has failed. A man who plans something this carefully does not give up after a single loss." "No," Eleanor agreed, watching the rain streak down the carriage window as they pulled away from the debtor's house. "He will not stop, which means we cannot afford to stop either, not until we understand exactly what he intends next." Neither of them yet knew how far Pemberton was prepared to go, or that the worst of his scheme had not yet begun. Her father was settled at Margaret's house that same night, given the largest guest room and a fire built high enough to chase the chill of the debtor's house from his bones. Eleanor sat with him until he fell asleep, exhausted from the ordeal, and only then did she allow herself to step into the hallway, where the Duke was waiting, still in his damp coat, refusing to leave until he knew her father was settled. "You should go home and change," Eleanor said. "You will catch a fever standing about in wet clothes." "I will go when I know you are safe," he said. "Pemberton has already shown he is willing to hurt the people you love in order to control you. I do not intend to leave you unprotected while he is still free to try again." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. There was something different in the way he spoke now, something that had not been there in the 3 years of their marriage before this terrible month. He sounded like a man who had finally decided that protecting her mattered more than protecting his own composure. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for tonight, for my father." "You do not need to thank me for that," he said. "It is the very least I owe you, after everything else." They stood together in the narrow hallway, the house quiet around them, and for a moment it seemed as though something might finally settle between them, some fragile beginning of trust rebuilding itself out of the wreckage of the past weeks. Then a note arrived. It came by a boy who claimed a gentleman had paid him $1 to deliver it directly into Eleanor's hands, and no one else's. She broke the seal in the hallway, the Duke watching over her shoulder, and felt the color drain from her face as she read it. Your father's debts are only the beginning. I have friends among your husband's own creditors, and a duke's fortune is not so bottomless as people believe. Come to me by tomorrow evening, alone, and I will call off everything I have set in motion. Refuse, and you will watch everyone you love lose everything, one piece at a time, until there is nothing left for either of you to protect. The Duke read it over her shoulder, his face darkening with a fury Eleanor had never seen in him before, not once in 3 years of marriage. He means to ruin us both, the Duke said, piece by piece, until you have no choice but to go to him simply to make it stop. I will not go to him, Eleanor said immediately, whatever he threatens. I know, the Duke said, but knowing that will not stop him from trying to force the matter. He folded the note carefully, his jaw tight. I will speak to my solicitor first thing tomorrow. Whatever debts Pemberton believes he can turn against us, I intend to settle or dispute every one of them before he has the chance to use them. And if that is not enough, Eleanor asked. Pemberton did not build this scheme in a single day, Alaric. He has been planning this for weeks, perhaps longer. A man who plans that carefully will have more than one way to strike. The Duke did not answer at first. He was thinking, she could see, of every vulnerable point in their lives that Pemberton might already know about, every place where money or reputation or family could be turned into a weapon. Then we will meet whatever comes, he said finally, together. I do not intend to let you face this alone, whatever else remains unresolved between us. Eleanor nodded, though a cold unease had settled in her stomach that would not entirely leave her for the rest of the night. The following days brought no peace. The Duke's solicitor confirmed that Pemberton had indeed purchased several outstanding debts connected to the Ashcombe estate, old obligations from Edmund's time that had never been fully settled, minor enough that no one had thought to worry over them before, but numerous enough, gathered together in a single hostile hand, to cause real difficulty if called in all at once. Worse, word began to spread through London that the Duke's brother had left behind a secret wife and child, a rumor that could only have come from Pemberton himself, twisted just enough to sound like scandal rather than the quiet tragedy it truly was. Charlotte, still recovering in Bath, wrote in fear, asking whether she and the child were now in danger of being found and exposed before the family had any chance to protect them properly. Eleanor found the Duke in his study late one evening, surrounded by papers, his face drawn with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. He is trying to break everything at once, the Duke said, without looking up. The debts, Charlotte's secret, my reputation. He knows that if enough pressure is applied in enough places at the same time, something will eventually give. Then we must decide which pressure to answer first, Eleanor said, sitting across from him. We cannot fight every fire at once and expect to win any of them. I do not know how to choose, he admitted, and there was something in his voice she had rarely heard from him, a rawness that sounded almost like fear. Then let us choose together, Eleanor said. That is what a marriage is meant to be, is it not? Not one person carrying every burden alone while the other waits to be told what has already been decided. He looked up at her then, and for a moment something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet, something that felt, despite everything, like the beginning of an actual partnership rather than an arrangement. It was, unfortunately, the very next evening that everything came apart. Eleanor had gone to deliver a music lesson to one of her students, a small errand she had continued through all the chaos of the past week, simply because it gave her something ordinary to hold on to. She was walking home afterward, her music case under her arm, when a carriage pulled alongside her on a quiet street, its curtains drawn. Before she understood what was happening, the door opened and a hand closed around her wrist, pulling her toward the opening with a strength that left no room for argument. She dropped her music case, the pages scattering across the cobblestones, and had only a moment to cry out before she was pulled inside and the door slammed shut behind her. Lord Pemberton sat across from her, entirely composed, as though he had merely invited her to tea. "You should have come to me on your own," he said, as the carriage lurched into motion. "This is so much less dignified." "Let me out," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fear pounding through her chest. "This is kidnapping, and you will hang for it." "I will do no such thing," Pemberton said calmly. "By the time anyone thinks to look for you, we will already have come to an understanding, and you will tell them yourself that you came willingly, to escape a marriage that had become unbearable to you. No one will believe that." "They will believe whatever I tell them to believe," Pemberton said, and for the first time, Eleanor heard something genuinely dangerous beneath his easy charm, something that suggested he had planned this moment for a very long time and did not intend to be talked out of it now. "You will come to my country house tonight. We will remain there together for several days, quite alone, and by the time you return to London, your reputation will be attached to mine, whether you wish it or not. Your Duke will have no choice but to release you from a marriage that has already been publicly ruined." Eleanor's mind raced. The carriage was moving quickly now, the street outside blurring past the small gap in the curtains, and she understood, with a cold clarity that steadied rather than panicked her, that she had only a short window in which to act before they left London entirely and any chance of rescue disappeared with it. She thought of her music case, dropped and scattered on the cobblestones. Someone would find it, someone would recognize it, but would they understand what it meant in time? She forced herself to remain calm, to keep her voice even, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "You are wrong about one thing," she said. "Am I?" Pemberton asked, amused. "You believe the Duke will simply let me go, once my reputation is ruined." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "You do not understand him at all. He rode through a storm without stopping to reach me, when he thought I might leave him over a misunderstanding. Do you truly believe he will do nothing at all, when he learns you have taken me by force?" For the first time, something flickered across Pemberton's confident expression, a small crack in the composure he had worn so easily until now. "He will not know where to look," Pemberton said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "He will," Eleanor said, "because I intend to make certain of it." And with that, before Pemberton could react, she threw herself toward the carriage door, wrenching it open despite the speed of the moving vehicle, and flung her glove out into the street, followed a moment later by the small silver hair clasp the Duke had given her on their wedding day, the only piece of jewelry from that day she had never been able to bring herself to remove, even in the darkest weeks of their separation. "What are you doing?" Pemberton snarled, grabbing for her arm. "Leaving a trail," Eleanor said, and for the first time that evening felt something like the ghost of a smile cross her own face, small and fierce. Back at the townhouse, the Duke had returned from a long and frustrating meeting with his solicitor to find the house in an uproar. Margaret met him at the door, pale and breathless, a scattered handful of sheet music clutched in her hands. "She never came home," Margaret said. "One of the neighbor's boys found her music case abandoned on Cross Street, the pages scattered as though she had dropped everything in a hurry or been made to drop it." The Duke felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Cross Street," he repeated, already turning back toward the door. "That is nowhere near her usual route home from a lesson." "No," Margaret said, "it is not." The Duke was in his carriage within minutes, his heart pounding with a fear sharper than anything he had felt even on the night he rode through the storm to reach her. He knew, without needing to be told, exactly who was capable of such a thing, and exactly how little time might remain before whatever Pemberton intended became impossible to undo. "You are lucky I am even willing to chase after this," he muttered to himself, the old bitter words rising unbidden from some cold corner of his memory, the same ugly phrase he had once let slip in anger, though this time the words caught in his throat and turned to ash before he could finish them, because he understood now, with a clarity that had cost him nearly everything to reach, that he was not doing her any favor by loving her. She had made him lucky, not the other way around, and if he lost her now, to a man like Pemberton, to his own past cowardice, to anything at all, he did not believe there would be enough of himself left afterward to build another life worth living. He reached Cross Street within the quarter hour, and it was there, in the gutter beside the abandoned road, that he found the small silver hair clasp glinting faintly in the lamplight, exactly where Eleanor had thrown it. He picked up the clasp with hands that shook, turning it over once in his palm before slipping it into his coat pocket, and looked up and down the darkened street for any further sign of the direction she had gone. A few yards further along, half hidden in a drain, he found her glove, and beyond that, nothing, the trail ending as abruptly as it had begun. He stood in the street for a long moment, forcing himself to think clearly despite the fear roaring through his chest. Pemberton owned a house in the city. Everyone knew that. But a man planning to keep a woman against her will for several days would not risk the city, where servants gossiped and neighbors noticed comings and goings. He would go somewhere more private, somewhere isolated. The Duke remembered, then, a conversation from years before, back when he and Pemberton had still moved in something resembling friendly circles, before ambition and old rivalries had curdled whatever civility had once existed between them. Pemberton had a country house, inherited from an uncle, some distance outside London, rarely used, staffed only by a handful of servants loyal to him alone. It was a thin thread to follow, but it was the only one he had. He rode through the night without stopping, his horse lathered with effort, his own body running on nothing but fear and determination. He reached the outskirts of the property just before dawn, the sky beginning to lighten at the edges, gray and reluctant, as though the world itself were unsure whether it wanted to witness what came next. The house sat at the end of a long, overgrown drive, dark and silent, except for a single lit window on the ground floor. The Duke left his horse tied some distance away, and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows of the untrimmed hedges, his heart hammering with a fear he had not felt since childhood. Inside, Eleanor had spent the night refusing every attempt Pemberton made to convince her that resistance was pointless. "You will only make this harder on yourself," he had told her, hours earlier, pacing before the fire in the small parlor where he had brought her, a locked door and two loyal servants standing between her and any hope of escape. "In a few days, none of this will matter. Your reputation will already be attached to mine. You will have no choice but to accept what has been decided." "Nothing has been decided," Eleanor had said, sitting very still in a hard-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, though her mind raced constantly for any possible way out. "You have decided something for yourself, and you have mistaken your own decision for a fact about the world. It is not the same thing." Pemberton had only smiled at that, the confident, untroubled smile of a man who had never once faced real consequences for anything he wanted badly enough. "You will understand, in time, that some fates are simply too large to fight." Eleanor had said nothing further, choosing instead to watch him carefully, to note the pattern of the servants' movements outside the door, the hours when the house grew quietest, the location of windows and doors, gathering every small piece of information she could in case an opportunity arose. It arose just before dawn, when one of the two servants guarding her door left briefly to relieve the other for a meal, leaving, for a handful of minutes, only a single man standing watch, and that man, exhausted from a long night, had begun to nod where he stood. Eleanor moved to the window as quietly as she could, testing the latch, and found it unlocked, whether through oversight or the simple assumption that a woman would never attempt to climb through a window in the dead of a cold morning. She had just eased it open, the cold air rushing in around her, when she heard a sound from below in the garden that made her freeze entirely still. Footsteps, careful, deliberate footsteps, moving through the overgrown hedges toward the house. For one terrible moment, she feared it was another of Pemberton's men. Then a familiar voice called up to her, low and urgent, barely more than a whisper carried on the cold morning air. "Eleanor?" She looked down and saw him standing below the window, his face pale with exhaustion, his coat torn from pushing through the hedges, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest ache, even in the middle of her fear. "Alaric," she breathed, "how did you find me?" "Your clasp," he said. "Your glove. You left me a trail, and I followed every inch of it." He glanced back toward the house, his voice dropping lower still. "Can you climb down? There is a trellis beneath the window, old but sturdy enough, I think, to hold your weight." Eleanor did not hesitate. She climbed out onto the narrow ledge, her heart pounding, and made her way down the old wooden trellis, her skirts catching twice on the rough wood, her hands scraping raw against the splintered edges, until she felt his arms close around her at the bottom, steady and certain, pulling her the last few feet to solid ground. For one brief moment, neither of them spoke. She simply stood there, held against him, feeling the frantic beat of his heart beneath her cheek, matching the frantic beat of her own. Then a shout went up from inside the house, and the moment shattered. "They have discovered you missing," the Duke said, already pulling her toward the tree line at the edge of the garden. "We must move quickly." They ran together through the overgrown grounds, the shouts behind them growing louder, a door slamming somewhere in the house, footsteps pounding after them. The Duke's horse was tied where he had left it, and he swung Eleanor up before him with a speed born of pure necessity, urging the animal into a gallop the moment she was settled. They had gone only a short distance down the drive when Pemberton himself appeared, mounted on his own horse, cutting across the field to intercept them before they could reach the main road. "You will not simply ride away from this," Pemberton called, drawing his horse up sharply in their path, blocking the narrow lane. "I have gone too far to let it end so easily." "You have gone too far, full stop," the Duke said, his voice cold and hard, in a way Eleanor had never heard from him before. "You have kidnapped a Duchess. You have threatened her family. You have spread lies about my brother's memory for the sole purpose of hurting a woman who never did anything to deserve your attention in the first place. Whatever you believed you were owed, Pemberton, you have exhausted every claim to it tonight." "No one will believe her word over mine," Pemberton said, though his voice had begun to lose its earlier confidence, something desperate creeping into the edges of it now. "I have friends. I have influence. You will find that ruining me is not so simple a matter as you believe." "Perhaps not," the Duke said, "but I have something more useful than influence tonight." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, holding it up in the pale morning light. "A signed statement from your own footman, given not an hour before I arrived at your house, describing in detail how you planned this abduction over several weeks, including the purchase of my family's debts, as part of a deliberate scheme to force my wife's hand." He was more than willing to speak, once I explained to him exactly how a man convicted of aiding a kidnapping is likely to be treated by the law, compared to a man who cooperates with the victim's rescue. Pemberton's face went white. "You are bluffing," he said, though his voice shook with the first genuine fear Eleanor had heard from him since this entire ordeal began. "I am not a man given to bluffing," the Duke said. "I am, however, a man who has learned this past month exactly how much I am willing to risk to protect what matters to me. You would do well to remember that before you consider blocking this road any longer." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Pemberton's horse shifted nervously beneath him, and something in his posture broke, the last of his composure crumbling away into something smaller and more frightened. He turned his horse aside, clearing the lane, and said nothing further as the Duke urged their own horse forward, past him, toward the main road and the long ride back to London. They did not speak again until they had put several miles between themselves and the house, the sun fully risen now, gilding the fields on either side of the road in pale gold morning light. Eleanor sat before him on the horse, his arms around her to steady the reins, and found, despite everything, that she felt entirely safe for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for finding me." "I would have searched every mile of England," he said. "I want you to understand that there is no version of these past weeks where I simply let you go, whatever mistakes I made in getting us here." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching the fields pass. You said something, once, that I have never forgotten, she said finally. The morning after our wedding, when I asked why you had chosen to marry me at all, given how little either of us wanted the arrangement, you said I was lucky you had married me, when so many other men might have simply let my father's debts destroy us both. The Duke's jaw tightened. I remember. It was a cruel thing to say, and worse, it was untrue even as I said it. I have thought of it often these past weeks, and I have come to understand something I did not understand then. What is that? That I was never the lucky one in that arrangement, nor the one making some great sacrifice, he said. You were the one who agreed to marry a stranger, to save a family that had already failed you in so many ways, and you did it with more grace than I have managed in 3 years of trying to deserve it. Whatever luck existed in that marriage belonged entirely to me, and I was too proud, for far too long, to admit it. Eleanor turned slightly to look up at him, her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears, though close to them. That is the first entirely honest thing you have ever said to me. It will not be the last, he said. I intend to spend considerably more time being honest with you, starting today, if you will allow it. They rode the rest of the way to London, in a silence that felt, for the first time in months, entirely comfortable rather than strained. The weeks that followed brought their own difficult work. Pemberton, stripped of his footman's loyalty and facing the very real threat of prosecution, fled to the continent before charges could be formally brought against him, his reputation collapsing far faster than any scheme he had built against the Ashcombe family. The debts he had purchased were settled quietly, the last of the pressure lifted from Eleanor's father, who recovered his health slowly but steadily under Margaret's careful watch. Charlotte and her child were brought to London at last, not in secret, but openly, the Duke standing beside Eleanor as they told the full truth to his mother and the small circle of family who mattered most. There was some difficulty at first, some resistance from an old woman who had spent a lifetime valuing reputation above nearly everything else, but grief and love, it turned out, were more persuasive than pride, and within a season, Charlotte's daughter was welcomed into the family as Edmund's rightful heir, his memory finally spoken of honestly, rather than buried beneath careful silence. Eleanor continued her music lessons, not because the family needed the income any longer, but because she had discovered, in the weeks of her separation, a version of herself she did not wish to give up entirely, a woman who built something with her own hands rather than simply inheriting a life shaped by other people's decisions. The Duke, for his part, learned slowly what it meant to speak before silence could do its damage, to tell Eleanor what troubled him before it curdled into something neither of them could untangle later. It did not happen all at once. Old habits, built over years of guarding himself against a world that had taught him early that vulnerability was a weakness, did not disappear simply because he wished them to. But he tried, each day, a little more than the day before, and Eleanor found that trying, offered honestly and repeated faithfully, was worth more than any grand romantic gesture could have been. On a quiet evening in early autumn, nearly a year after the night of the ball where everything had first begun to unravel, Eleanor found her husband once again in the library, though this time it was daylight, and there were no hidden letters spread secretly across the desk. "What are you reading?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "A letter from Charlotte," he said, smiling faintly. "She writes that her daughter has said her first word. Apparently it was not Mama, nor Papa, but rather horse, upon seeing one of the stable ponies through the nursery window." Eleanor laughed, a real and easy laugh, the kind she had not allowed herself in a very long time before that terrible autumn began. "A fitting first word for a child born into this family," she said. The Duke set the letter down and looked at her for a long moment, something quiet and grateful in his expression. "I do not think I ever properly thanked you," he said, "for staying, after everything. You had every reason to leave and never look back, and instead, you chose to fight for something that had given you very little reason to trust it would be worth fighting for." "I did not stay out of duty," Eleanor said. "I want you to understand that. I stayed because somewhere beneath all the silence and all the mistakes, I found a man worth staying for, once he finally let me see him clearly. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, without hesitation, without the careful guardedness that had once governed nearly every moment between them. "I love you," he said simply, the words no longer trapped behind pride or fear, but offered plainly, the way they should always have been offered, from the very beginning. "I know," Eleanor said, smiling. "You are, in fact, quite lucky I married you at all." He laughed then, a genuine, surprised sound, and for the first time in 3 long years, the old words that had once broken something between them became instead the beginning of a joke they would share for the rest of their lives together, a small private history that belonged only to the two of them, built at last on truth instead of silence.